Starting. Make sure the file's in there. All right, cool. Hey, everybody, this is PODLOMATIC episode 32. My guest today is Tim Lin. Introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, this is Timothy Lim.
Tim is a. Well, I want to ask you about your biography, like I just mentioned, but I'm curious about. You have a very long resume. Is it just art, writing as well? How would you describe yourself professionally?
It's all over the map. So I guess technically I'm a freelance illustrator. Some people see me as a political cartoonist, which is I think fair as well, but this is not my full-time job. I actually got my doctorate degree in audiology in 2011. I am licensed to practice in the state of Arkansas. I can see patients and I teach graduate and undergraduate courses as well as part of the University of Arkansas system, whether that be the University of Arkansas at Little Rock or the University of Arkansas at Medical Sciences.
Mhm.
At the time of this recording, I'm actually on sabbatical, but I do have a licensure that is still in play, and I keep that just in case I do need to do some outside contract work. But I guess for my primary resume, I mean, I've kind of done a little bit of everything from merchandising to comics, so it kind of just depends on what people are looking for.
Mhm. Was it when you pursued your degree? Was it just sort of I have to get a degree? What inspired you to get it?
If my parents ever listen to this, I'm sure they're gonna kill me, but that's fine. I've told this story before.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Um, I'm Asian, if people can't tell or don't know. Anyway, and there's that joke in Asian culture, especially in America, that you're basically considered a failure if you're not a lawyer, a doctor, or an engineer. And pretty much everyone in my family is in the medical field, whether that be medical sciences, physicians, therapists, or nurses. And
Mhm.
so I was always on a medical route. Just it was almost just like fate or destiny or whatever. Just I was kind of doomed at birth that that was where I was going to go. And I chose audiology because it's a burgeoning field. It actually hasn't been around for that long. People trace its inception to the post World War II era, and so I was very intrigued by it. It's actually ranked as the most comfortable job in America to have because we don't work long hours. Mortality rate for patients based on direct patient care is almost non-existent. It just doesn't happen, and it pays very well. And so, looking at my choices after I graduated with my bachelor's degree, which was in psychology, it just made the most sense. And it was a 4-year program. The last year, you're actually kind of in a residency. And so that was the direction I took, and that made my parents happy because they wanted wanted their sons to have a doctorate degree of some sort, and so I was able to accomplish that. It was not the field I wanted to go in ever since I was a kid. I knew I wanted to do something in the medical field. I just didn't know it would be that, and that's kind of where I found myself.
Hmm. And age-wise, are you comfortable kind of saying what years this all happened? Because I guess
Yeah, yeah,
a doctorate takes eight
sure,
years, right?
correct. So it actually depends. If you're getting an MD, a medical doctorate, which is what my wife has. So this is confusing. I know a lot of people criticize me and they're like, "He's not a real doctor." I was like, "Well, I have a doctorate degree. It kind of depends on what you mean by doctor." And I know that sounds kind of like a very political way of speaking, but for example, if you have an expert who's a PhD, you hear him referred to as Doctor So and so. For example, like one of our friends, Dr. Sebastian Gorka, he can't cut people open, but he has a doctorate degree in I think it's unusual warfare is what his degree is. So obviously people they credit him as Dr. Sebastian Gorka. So you
I
have
see.
PhDs, you have DDSs, which are doctors of dental sciences. You have PhDs, doctors of philosophy. You have MDs, medical doctors. You have JDs, Juris Doctorates, and then for my field, you have AUDs, audiology doctors, doctors of audiology. It is granted by the medical school, and so that is what my certification is. And so that is actually a 4-year program. MDs are actually a 4-year program as well, but it depends on your residency. So, for example, my wife right now is going through her general surgery residency, which is 5 years. So you could see it as a 9 year program, whereas being like a family physician or being more specialized, that can alter your residency years. So it kind of just depends. But for the most part, just getting the degree itself is a 4 year program.
Is it any? I have a million questions, so I hope this isn't boring for anyone listening. Uh, is it a coincidence that you're so interested in radio and all that stuff? Is it
Uh,
related?
Completely by coincidence. It's 100% by coincidence, actually.
All right,
I
that's a dead
actually
end.
didn't. I actually didn't start listening to talk radio until my wife got me interested in podcasts
Mm.
because we do a lot of traveling, and especially when she was interviewing, she was traveling across the country, and I would ask her, I'm like, how in the world do you stay awake when you have to, you're driving from like Savannah, Georgia to North Carolina to this state and then back, and you're all by yourself.
Yeah.
And she said, well, it's pretty easy when you listen to podcasts and you listen to audiobooks.
Hmm.
And I never really thought about that because I was like, you know what, you're kind of right because I do my best staying awake when I have someone in the passenger seat to talk to. In fact, I'm actually never sleepy when it's like that because you're constantly interacting.
Yeah.
And I just got used to listening to music. Frankly, even though I've known about Rush Limbaugh forever, I never gave him a listen because I never listened to talk radio. And so she got me listening to it because I got kind of tired of listening to the radio and listening to the same pop music all the time and my CDs all the time. So I started doing that, and sure enough, I found it more engaging.
Hmm.
So a lot of things happening with radio and stuff that actually came into play very late in the game, almost having nothing to do with my vocation, which involves ears.
Right. Right. Coincidence then. Well,
Yes.
actually, that does. I tend to take rabbit trails. I apologize for anyone listening. They already
Oh, I
know.
know all about rabbit trails.
I can ask
Ba-dum-bum-ba-dum-bum.
that. I'll ask about that too. Um, well, one of the things that we do as artists, I'm sure, is spend very, very long hours at our desks. And for the past few years, what I've been doing is listening to things like interviews like what we're doing now, audiobooks, anything to sort of keep my mind engaged. Um, how do you or can you draw and listen to things at the same time? Do you find that you have to concentrate, or is it like driving?
Not really. That's actually when you go to conventions, that's a question you get all the time from people who are like watching you do a commission. They'll hover over you and they're very intrigued and they're very apologetic and they're like, "Oh, I'm sorry if I'm bothering you." And I'm like, "Oh, no, it's not a problem. I'm fine with people doing that." But I think there's two types of people who observe, and my reaction is different. If you're a fan or you're a customer and you're looking at how I'm drawing, that doesn't bother me at all because I mean, this is something that I have to do and have been doing for some years already. But if you're a critic, if you're watching over me because you want to point out something almost from an editorial point of view, yes, that does definitely bother me. And it doesn't happen too often, but occasionally it will. I have a friend in particular whose advice I never take, but occasionally he'll watch me as I draw, and he's the person I tell to go away because I'm like, nah, I can't do this while you're hovering over me
Hmm.
because I know you're a micromanager and you're gonna nitpick, and frankly, I don't need that type of editorializing at this moment. So I think it can be a little bit different, but that hasn't been something that's really bothered me. I can walk and chew gum at the same time. And so when I listen to mostly YouTube videos and Rush from 11 till 2, I am not distracted at all. I mean, I put aside one part of my brain and I listen. And the part of me that's the motor function, I'm at the point where I'm on autopilot where I can manage it. Now, the difference is that I think where I get distracted is I have a hard time drawing and engaging in conversation at the same time. So when my wife is talking to me while I'm drawing, that's very hard. I actually have to put everything down and be engaged in what she's talking about because that's not a passive engagement. That's an active engagement.
I see. Yeah, it's. I think if it's a drawing that isn't challenging me, I find it's motor function, just the body's kind of doing whatever it wants to do. But if it's something like dialogue, or if we're acting, like a character's making a certain facial expression, I have to concentrate on that.
Right.
It's like we're having a conversation with ourselves in our mind, and I
Uh-huh.
can't. I don't know. I like to ask these things of different artists because everybody seems to approach their art in a different way.
Well, actually, so this is actually a good point of conversation because you know how runners will talk about like a second wind? Uh,
Marathon types.
yeah, yeah, marathon types. Okay. I've never ran a marathon and I'm not good at running.
Yeah.
So I don't know what that's like, but I believe it because obviously you hear it all the time. And knowing how the mind body connection works, there is something to be said there. I mean, if you think about it, we don't even remember how it was like learning how to walk. I mean, I'm sure if we were regressed back to that age, we'd be like, "Holy cow, this is impossible.
Hmm.
How in the world am I standing upright and walking? This is never going to happen."
Yeah.
Same thing with anything we take for granted, like riding a bike. It's very hard for us to think back at a time when that was not natural, but we've just been doing it for so long that it is.
Yeah.
And one of the things I tell artists is, just having done this for a while, they're like, what is one of the best moments you can achieve as an artist? And it might be unique to me, but I've heard it from different people. But I tell them it's the part where you reach a day where you notice that you don't have to try anymore.
Mm.
Not necessarily for everything, because for example, I suck at drawing buildings, I suck at drawing nature, just backgrounds in general. I do have a little bit of a struggle with. But as far as like humans and organic objects go, I no longer have that problem. Like it's as complex to me as like an algebraic um, problem, like 4 plus 4, 7 plus 10, that type of thing. Like the
Mm.
mental gymnastics of having to do that is not a hard calculus. It's something that I can do pretty easily. But I just remember there was just a day that came maybe 5 or 6 years ago where I was like, holy cow, I can do this from beginning to end. And it wasn't taxing on me mentally to achieve this. And I talked to Matt Weldon a lot, who is a friend of mine, a fellow artist, a really good friend here in Texas. And he's like a human printer. Like he can take a pencil and he can just draw out of his mind, and he doesn't even have to look at references or anything. It just happens. And I said, how does that feel when you do that? And he's like, bruh, like this happened so long ago, and I haven't really looked back, but I don't think about it too much because if I do, I think that's where you end up choking.
Hmm.
It's kind of like you're doing the 3 point or the free throw, and everyone in the arena is looking at you, and there's that part of your brain that that almost wants to switch that off because it's like being cognizant of it is actually what's going to hamper you. What you want to do, and I forgot which famous basketball player said this, but he said that he says things like in his head he thinks about something else when he's making that free throw because he wants the motor function to take over,
Mm.
and thinking about it is actually what's going to slow him down. And so I reached a point where it's not perfect, but just drawing things like faces, drawing things like upper torsos, I don't really have to struggle with it anymore. It just kind of comes out naturally, and it doesn't bother me as much when people try to interrupt me or talk to me or whatever.
Yeah, there's something called the 10,000 hour rule that I always subscribe to.
Yes, Malcolm Gladwell is
Yeah.
where I first heard that,
Yes.
and it's great. If you want to explain it to your listeners, I'll cede the floor to you.
No, no, it's far more interesting. They've heard me mention it before, but I don't think the exact number is necessarily important. But there's a rough number if you want to go for it.
Yeah, so basically, it was, oh my gosh, I don't remember the book. I've read three of Malcolm Gladwell's books, and I don't remember which one it is. But he basically he I think Malcolm Gladwell is kind of this. He's a guy who made like basically it's like pop psychology fun or whatever, armchair psychology.
Mhm.
And the basic rule is that if you look at how long people train for anything, whether it be sports, flying a plane, a blue collar job, it takes roughly 10,000 hours to master something, to get to the point where you can do it effortlessly and achieve a level of confidence and proficiency where you don't have to try anymore. I have not timed myself, so I don't know exactly if I've achieved 10,000 hours of doing something, but um, basically the rule of thumb is that it takes a long time to do it, and it
Yeah.
takes a long time to get good at something.
Yeah, when it as it relates especially to what we talked. Well, you mentioned motor function. I always use the basketball free throws, that sort of thing analogy. You're really training your body. I'm sure you know way more about this than I do. There's all those connections between the hand, between the eye, the brain. There's all these stops along the highway that you have to sort of, the more you do it, the more your mind and your body synchronize. And as a beginning artist, maybe we have to train our hands just to, we have a model in front of us and we say, okay, I want to draw this model, this exact pose. And you're trying to tell your hand how to do it. And your hand can't quite copy what you see. So you're trying, at first, when you're just starting to learn, you're learning the motor functions, just to get your hand to obey you. And that takes years. And then things like when I have art students who start out, they talk about style. And I say, no, 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 don't even think about style at this point.
Correct.
You got to get your hand to listen to you. And then you can do things like, okay, build a mental library, which means like I've drawn a million hands. And now when I'm drawing a page, I don't have time to look at reference. I'm just going to pull a wireframe of a hand out from my mental library, let's say, because I've drawn so many hands that I remember, okay, this is kind of what this pose should look like. When you're drawing comics, especially, I'm sure everybody has a different style. I don't use reference because it just takes too long. So I don't. Time and speed is a really important factor when I'm drawing. Do you use reference? Do you pull from memory when you draw comics specifically?
That idea that you have of pulling reference from your mind, I've actually never thought of it in those terms. So I'm actually going to steal that idea from you, but it's completely true.
Sure.
I do it all the time. For example, for women, you always hear this complaint from people who are ne'er-do-wells that, oh my gosh, like all these women look the same. And it's like, well, part of that's true because the ideal of beauty for women tends to meet a certain standard. And so I think a lot of artists, they have this view of how, like, in their mind at least, how the idealized form of a female should be. And then it's just minor changes, change how their earlobes look, change how thick their eyebrows are, change how prominent their nose might be or how thick their lips might be. So you start with this kind of prototypical or archetypical view in the mind, and then you go from there. And same thing with men. I mean, I have very different ways of drawing men's faces, but they all start on basically, it's like, okay, is this character burly or is he lean? Is he fat or is he skinny? And in my mind, I pick that kind of blank sort of NPC template out, and then I put it on paper and I just augment it the way I see fit. I do use references for, like we said before, like backgrounds, because particularly like on a book like Soul Finder, which is the book I did with Doug Ernst, he wanted something serious. It's a serious book, quote unquote serious. It's definitely, it doesn't have the levity that I'm used to in things I work on. And when he says, well, I want this cityscape to look very reminiscent of like a neighborhood in Maryland. Well, I've actually never been to Maryland. I've been to DC, which is close enough, but I don't have a mental image of what that looks like. Mm-hmm. So I have to go on Google Images and I have to look up these city streets and stuff like that. And especially when I was up in DC during a visit this spring, I took a lot of pictures in this neighborhood that we were in because I'm like, this is definitely going to come in handy later on. But it's interesting because, like, for Walmart, I didn't use any references whatsoever because it's a goofy parody satire book. There's a lot of squatch and stretch. And so, for example, I had to draw Kennedy Space Center. I didn't even look at what Kennedy Space Center looked like. I think I went Google Images and I saw one landmark, and like my brain took a snapshot of it. Mm-hmm. And I was like, if I can get close enough, no one's going to mind. Like, no one's going to go on Google Images and be like, well, actually, Timothy Lim's Kennedy Space Center is nowhere near like how it is in real life. And like no one's gonna really pay attention to that.
That's an important question, is intent. And
correct.
Things like, well, I always have that joking character from The Simpsons, the comic book guy, where it's like, this is not photorealistic, therefore comic is ruined, I will never read it again. I'm always giving myself that measuring stick when I'm trying to ask myself, is this panel finished enough? Whereas if I spent another hour on it, would it really affect anyone's reading experience? So I always try to stop myself at the point where I say, this panel communicates exactly what I want it to. It's time to move on to the next one.
Right. And that's really cool that you mentioned that. So I have 3 friends and all of them read comics in very different ways. So I have the one friend who is solely a consumer. He has no artistic taste whatsoever. He likes what he likes. He can't explain why he likes it. He just likes it. And so what he'll do, like for example, I'll give him a 38 page or 32 page comic. So, to thick enough so it is you get a lot of material, but thin enough so that you can get through it typically within like 30 minutes to an hour. And I give it to him, and he'll finish that book in 15 minutes flat, because he's not studying it. He's just following the story. And at the end, I'm like, well, what'd you think? And he's like, oh, it was good. And I say, well, did you like the way that one scene, that splash page looked? He's like, which one? And I'm like, there was only one splash page in the book. Oh, I didn't notice it. Because as a reader, he doesn't care about it. He's kind of, it's like in a movie theater when you don't pay attention to the people next to you because you're so engrossed in what you're watching that you don't notice that the guy next to you is picking his nose or whatever.
Yeah.
He doesn't care because to him, it's just, can I follow the story? I have a second friend who is like he's our agent, he's our manager, and he is kind of in between because he'll read it. It'll take him. He's a little bit slower, but he's able to actually pick out what he likes. But it's on a very superficial level. He's like, I like this scene because when he punched that guy, man, like you could see his teeth flying out. That was cool. And so he has a little bit more criticism in there because he's actually going through and he almost has a checklist of things that amuse him or entertain him, and that's what he wants. And then the third friend I have is like my co-creator Mark. He studies the language and the art of comics. So he actually intuitively and self-awarely knows and is looking for what is it in here that I like? How is it structured? And so he's very critical. So he'll actually go through a book and he's able to kind of fine tune it. He'll take that 32 book and he'll take him an hour to actually dissect it and tell people what it is that he likes and not. But what I tell a lot of like first time artists or people who are very nervous about getting into comics is don't pay attention to those latter two. Pay attention to that first guy because that's your audience. Like that's the guy that ultimately is going to be the one who's going to decide whether they like your book and if they're going to pick it up a second time to be enthralled for that second issue.
Yeah.
And so as artists, we're always having to kind of measure ourselves between quality and speed.
Yes.
And I always say that between the two, I always err on the side of speed because that first guy, trust me, is not going to notice that 2 out of your 5 panels don't have backgrounds. They're not. That is an artist trick that we all use. And it's funny that you bring it up because, for example, on Soul Finder, Doug Ernstein's pages come in one at a time, right? And so he texts me on Monday and he is like, hey, I'm noticing something here because on this page that you and Brett turned in, there isn't a background in this one panel. And I was like, and he was like, is that normal? I was like, that is completely normal, but you don't notice it because if you're only used to reading comics, you tend to not notice that that's not there. But I remember because this happened to me in the past before I started drawing comics myself. There were certain books I would read. For example, like whenever Alex Ross would put out a book, and I love his art, I would find myself going to sleep like halfway through. And I'm like, I don't know why. I mean, the story is good, the art is fantastic. Like, I don't know why I'm so sleepy because I don't feel like it's not boring, it's not poorly written. And it wasn't until years later that I figured it out. It's mental fatigue.
Yes.
It's your eye is getting tired of seeing this. It's kind of like why, frankly, when I go to museums, I can't stay in a museum for more than 2 hours because it's like, okay, beautiful beautiful painting number 2. And it's like our brains want to enjoy the visual stimulation for as long as we can take one thing, and to get overstimulated becomes a task. It's kind of like watching like the second Transformers movie. It's like 3 hours of explosions, and I was listening to these critics and they're like, I fell asleep.
Yeah.
Like, how in the world can you make that boring? And it's like, well, it's not because it's boring, it's because you can have too much of a good thing.
Right. And I think I would guess that you and I have a similar background with manga and anime. Would that be correct?
Yes, I would say so.
So, the disciplines of manga, I'm fascinated by this as a science. The East versus West conversation. How comics are rendered and paced and composed from let's say America versus Japan, what are some of the similarities and differences? You mentioned, for instance, pacing, lack of backgrounds. Americans might, let's say, American creators might consider it a lesser art form. Manga. Oh, this art is too simplified. It's in black and white. It's what's with 5 pages depicting one guy picking up a cup and sipping from it. Why is that? Why they take 5 pages to do that? What kind of things have you noticed when you contrast the art forms?
So that's a really good question because I actually haven't been reading manga a lot until this year.
Oh,
So obviously, we've had this conversation before, but I did not grow up on anime. In fact, I kind of hated it because there were just so many things that I mean, we're talking beyond tropes here. Like they all had it. It was annoying to the point where I was like, oh my gosh, I don't even want to invest time in this because it's not what I'm used to. For example, in a lot of like anime I watched in the 90s, I just knew that every ending was going to be terrible. Either the main character is going to die, or there's this kind of pseudo philosophical ending where they don't want to commit to something concrete. It's very not antithetical, but it's very different to what I'm used to from kind of a Western flavor. So, going back into anime, I was like, oh my gosh, well, I think they're learning things from the West because a lot of the anime I've watched recently, it's upbeat, it's optimistic. They kind of understand the heroic archetype far beyond what, we're failing at right now. And so I started dipping into manga and I noticed a couple things. So Mark and I were talking about this. One thing is in Western comics, there are a lot of passages that you can quote because of the kind of flowery language that the writers use. And part of it has to do with the decompression of manga versus anime or manga versus comics. Manga is very decompressed. Obviously they're digest size, they take their time, they show you everything. They have a team that's kind of working on that manga behind the scenes, and so they have the time to be able to kind of spread it out and let you take it all in. But that also means that I think that the language is a whole lot less dramatic. They don't commit a lot of time to filling space with a lot of flowery dialogue. They try to get right to the point. And so that's why even in manga that I like, when someone's like, "Oh, can you quote like, chapter and verse of what this character said?" I'm like, "No, because I can quote you like if you ask me right now for a great anime quote, I can only pull up one, or a great manga quote. The only one I can pull up is when Saitama is fighting like the main bad guy on top of this space cruiser, and the guy is going through his whole thing and he's powering up, and Saitama says, "Okay." Just one word, "Okay." That's the only thing I remember as being very distinguished in the manga I've been reading recently.
mm,
And so because they don't, it's as if they don't commit the time to trying to blow you away by the language. They do storytelling by the visual medium. They show and they don't tell, which is good. And I think we listened to recent reviews by John Della Rose, and he talks about passive voice, and it's this idea of don't use these words too often. If you can show something without actually having it explained to you, that is much more preferable. And I think that's one reason why people nowadays, especially younger people, they really like manga because of that type of storytelling. And obviously, we talked about like the lack of backgrounds. They use a lot of patterns and stuff to evoke emotion, and I like that personally. I think that's really cool.
mhm.
Yes, I mean it's like stock images and stock patterns that you could just find anywhere or buy, but it works. I mean, whenever I see like a flowery pattern or a starry pattern behind like a guy or a girl, you don't even have to tell me that they're in love or something. I just know it because it's the visual shorthand for expressing that emotion.
Mm.
And I'm sure that some people might not like it, but the interesting thing is that you're able to figure it out without that much help. For example, like my wife just started watching anime, and I was like telling her, "Oh, in some of these anime, you'll notice like a guy has like a nosebleed," and she was like, "Yeah, it was kind of weird, but I just figured out that it just meant that they just saw something, or there was a girl who was in a skimpy bikini or something, and that's the visual shorthand for oh my gosh, that's incredible, or that's something that is that turns me on or whatever. And
Sure.
so I think that that type of language via the arts is something that makes manga very enticing compared to Western comics, which really doesn't have that much of a visual shorthand. In fact, I think a lot of our visual shorthand comes from lettering. I've been I've been looking at a lot of online lettering videos and tutorials, and there's oh my gosh, there's so much I didn't know about it that I'm learning, and it makes sense. And I feel like a dummy, having gone through like 3 books without really knowing any of this stuff.
Hmm. One of the things that you mentioned that really struck a chord with me is this idea of show don't tell. I know that a lot of manga, the roots of manga, is based on cinema and the especially silent film, where the whole discipline is trying to tell a story without any words at all. And I've always thought that the best manga, and comics as well, but especially manga, can be told without words at all. Or even if I don't speak or read Japanese very well, I can still understand what's going on in the story just by the visuals. I think one of the master strokes of this medium called comics is being able to communicate a story not just through words, but sort of like hieroglyphics, even. I'm reading the pictures and I'm reading words too. So you're almost getting a double story. And part of the beautiful thing about comics is this thing that you could call audience participation, which, for instance, some backgrounds in panels don't exist, but that's because we've already downloaded that information. That background has always already been put into the audience's brain using an establishing shot a few panels ago. So the reader is now participating by projecting that background or any background that they can imagine into that panel that's blank. Or, for instance, I use Impressionism as another example. These are, loose, scratchy strokes and dots, pointillism, that sort of thing. Splashes of color here and there, very fast paintings. But because they're not polished, they almost invite the audience to step forward and finish the painting in their own mind. And I think when you talk about speed versus quality, that's an amazing. Comics can be, or manga definitely is almost impressionistic. I think it's reductive. Cartooning, I should say, the least number of strokes possible. Sometimes whatever can be the fastest to communicate the idea in a panel, move on to the next panel.
Yes, and to that notion too, it's kind of like uh, looking at comics and looking at manga. I mean, if you look at like our taste in what we like as far as artists are concerned, so I like originally I was studying a lot of Yusuke Murata. He's the artist on One Punch Man because it's so detailed. I mean, this guy is like he's a virtuoso when it comes to inking because he has these very deliberate strokes and he uses a lot of them. So it's not minimalist at all. But when in terms of looking and studying these people, the other one I like on the opposite end of the spectrum is like Sushio. Sushio did a lot of the character designs on Kill la Kill. It's very clean, it's very cartoonish in the sense of a very pared down minimalist style. But between the two, in terms of the aesthetic that I find more pleasing, it's the latter. And that might be because of personal preference, but it's the idea that he's able to boil down kind of very complex designs into very pleasing geometric shapes. So it's almost like he knows the source code of what is appealing and what is basic to knowing that an object is there. Because one of the things that I teach students who are more mature is this concept of pareidolia. Pareidolia is this idea of seeing patterns in things that aren't really there. The prime example that people use is kind of like the face of the man on Mars. It's kind of like, oh my gosh, an ancient civilization put a face on the face of Mars. But when you look at that landscape from like the Mars rover or whatever, there's really nothing there. It's just a trick of light that happens to show it. But the mind can't help but see patterns where they are. And so one of the things I teach, like especially high school or college students, is I'll draw like a dot and I'll say, what is that? And they're kind of confused and they're like, it's a dot. And I draw another dot and I'll say, what's that? A second dot. And I'll draw a third dot. It's like, what is that? It's a third dot. And I draw a line underneath it. I'm like, what is that? It's a face.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, it's not a face. It's three dots and a line.
Mm-hmm.
But your mind put it together that it is that there's something there that's not. So anytime that an artist actually draws something, it's an optical illusion. It's almost like doing magic where we fool an audience into seeing something there that it's not. And so when I do that, they're like, oh my gosh, like it's kind of a little bit of a mental exercise, but it's this idea of if you can get from A to Z using the shortest line possible, you will achieve what you want, which is to tell your story using the visual medium. And so, this idea that you have of the audience participating by essentially downloading a background in their head and then projecting it, I think that's beautiful. That's another thing I'm going to steal from you. But I also tell people I study a lot of Watterson, like Calvin and Hobbes,
Mm.
and I study a lot. He doesn't have like a huge library of work he's done outside of that, besides like editorial cartoons and things like that. But one thing I always loved about Calvin and Hobbes is I loved how he did backgrounds because they're like Calvin and Hobbes are walking through a fall day, and all he'll do is he'll take like a watercolor mixture of orange, yellow, and green, and he'll just put like a splash here and there, and then he'll just make these quick strokes with a pen, and you get the idea that, oh, those are twigs and the watercolor is leaves, and they're fading into the background as they walk towards like a sunny day.
Mm-hmm.
And when you dissect it, it's like, no, it's just watercolors, but the mind cannot help but seeing something there that's not there. And I mean, I've been doing this since I was like 7, reading Calvin and Hobbes, and even at my fragile 7-year-old immature mind, I was able to kind of see that and feel that. And same thing with like his winter days. It's kind of like, oh my gosh, I really don't have to try now because all I have to do is just kind of show where rocks are peeking out of the snow
Mm-hmm.
or leaves are peeking out. And the mind gets it, it understands. And so you're right, you end up being kind of a participant in that by kind of this impressionist approach. So there's so many ways that artists can look at it that I think one pitfall that they make, and I think it's because in art school, obviously, or growing up attending art classes, there's a rubric that we have to follow. It's like, here's how you draw the face. And it's like, oh yes, sir. Like, this is how we're going to draw the face. But the reality is that as you get older, it's like you know the rules and then you can break them
Mm-hmm.
later on. But you have to know them first. And then once you find that out, then you can kind of delve into the source code and break it down and be like, okay, I don't need to do all those extra steps. All I have to do is just make sure that this thing looks and feels the way it's supposed to.
Yeah. It reminds me of I read a lot of samurai mangas, so there you got something called Vagabond, where you get the ultimate master will just stand there with his sword, and he doesn't even need to do anything, and he'll make one stroke and finish his enemy. But
Right.
on the other hand, you got like a wild man, a berserker type, who's making all these unnecessary movements and flipping around and diving and slashing and faking. And it's like, okay, you're just compensating. You don't actually know what you're doing. You're looking for that one stroke that's going to finish your enemy. But of course, you could argue that anybody could have done that one stroke. But I think it takes a master, someone that has done the 10,000 hours. You mentioned Watterson as another. I actually want to ask you about Watterson later. But like, all right, for instance, he'll have an open panel, and I also say this with Schultz as well, but Watterson's a way better draftsman. He can do like 3 strokes on the ground. You mentioned a rock. 3 strokes means grass, and then
Right.
the reader's projecting their ideal image of whatever that field looks like in the back of their head. Pareidolia, you said?
Yeah, pareidolia.
That's a great word, man. I have to write that down. I'm writing down stuff as you're talking too. I
It's
think,
it's spelled Pareidolia.
yeah,
And you see it all the time, like the Virgin Mary in toast. That's like another one.
yes,
The one it's like once you see it, you can't forget it. It's like when you look at cars and you see like the face in cars, like the headlights are 2 eyes and the bumper is the
yes,
mouth, or the grill.
yeah. Well, it's an interesting thing that the mind, well, I guess maybe it's a genetic thing, who knows? But we're sort of designed, our brains are designed to look for patterns and personify things. And it can be related to symbols and written language, but at the end of the day, I think there's just a sort of some people's minds work in such a way that, like, for instance, pixel art. I think there's more to pixel art than just, oh, it's something that we grew up with. 8 and 16-bit games, even 32-bit games, they say they're very nostalgic. And I think that word is
Right.
very interesting. It harkens back to like our childhood, which is fine, but I think there's also something more to it that
I
when,
completely agree, and I know where
okay,
you're going with this.
wow, I mean,
It's almost
very,
it's almost primal, right?
yeah,
It's this idea that it's not so much that we yearn for a temporally simplistic time,
yeah.
it's that we yearn for simplicity, I think.
There's something participatory in the, like, say, Watterson. A kid can read Calvin and Hobbes and understand it very, very deeply just by looking at the pictures. Maybe they don't even know how to read, but they understand it. They're putting themselves in the comic in a way that if I, the artist, did all the drawings for you, there's nothing for you to project into the panels. You're just reading it. It's like a one-way road. But
Right.
if I'm inviting you, like with pixel art, let's say, what's behind? All right, I'm going to show you a picture of a mountain, some trees, Bob Ross style. But what's behind that mountain? I want you, the reader, whoever's listening, to put whatever's behind those mountains in your head. You need to, all right, what's on the other sides of the frame, the panel? You can't see beyond the panel, but maybe you can imagine what's beyond the panel. It's my job to, I think, the best comics, the most nostalgic comics, the ones that tap into something deeper than just I'm reading a book, are ones that invite participation. That's where you don't have a passive reading experience when you're, I don't know. We talk about Watterson as the ultimate example. I have to think of better examples, but I think the best comics invite readers to almost fill in the blanks. And unless there are blanks to fill, you can't get participation. That's why I would argue, but I'm biased. I love manga way more than I love American comics. But I would argue that that's why manga is so strong, is because there is empty space. That's a cultural thing with Japan anyway. They like empty space because it represents, mastery and all that stuff. I got really far off. I'm
No,
so
no,
sorry.
I like where this is going. It's kind of like you want to talk about pareidolia and kind of East versus West. So I this is something that to me is very interesting. Have you heard of the rabbit on the moon?
I'm not sure.
So there's a folklore, a legend that is more prevalent in Japan than anywhere else, but it's the idea of a rabbit in the moon. And it's because the Japanese would look up at the sky and they saw a rabbit in the moon basically with a hammer. And so they would tell kids that there was a rabbit on the moon and he makes mochi, right? Now, here's the weird thing. The Chinese saw the same thing, and cultures around the world see this rabbit in the moon, but
Mm-hmm.
it never really reached America, I don't think. I might be mistaken. I think there might have been Native Americans who might have seen it and put it in their folk tales. But even the Chinese, when they launched their first lunar orbiter, they actually named it after like the legend of the moon rabbit. But I have never in my life looked up at the moon and saw a rabbit
Hmm.
in the moon. And so you have that notion of pareidolia even in there, and I think it's part of whether it's comics or anything. There is just this human tendency to want to project or insert yourself into any type of storytelling. It makes for a richer experience. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
in fact, that's why we go to movies, I would argue. So movies, for example, we go for like, the big screen. We want the spectacle, but it's the full immersive experience. It's the idea that a movie screen will typically encapsulate your whole field of vision. There's not much for your peripheral vision to take in, and you want to enjoy it. And that's why, we get so annoyed when people talk or text during a movie, because it makes it so that you can't immerse yourself in it.
Mm-hmm.
And so that even though you have movies that obviously don't lend much towards self-insertion. It's the idea that you are in the movie itself just by your participation, whether it be active or passive.
Right. A sort of suspension of disbelief, not in terms of readership, but just the submersion in the illusion of whatever you're watching, I suppose.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with it. But talking about East versus West, so nowadays you and I are reading more manga than we are American comics. But that's not to say that it's very. I mean, you're always going to hear this kind of argument of which one is superior. Whereas I kind of see the two as complementary because in Western comics, obviously you have your classics, and they're classics not just because the art is good, but because the storytelling is good as well. And so there is something to be said about the exposition that are in some master works of comics, as far as Western fiction is concerned. And so I don't want to discount it completely, but they're few and far in between. I mean, as far as comics I've read recently, the one that's ongoing right now, which is X-Men, House of X, Powers of X, it is so good that it was actually I felt like it was like an undiscovered story from back in the day when I felt like storytellers actually really cared about these characters. And just when I thought that everything that could be done with this fictional universe had been done, I get the rug pulled out from under me. So I think there's hope for the medium, and I think the best thing that we can do is learn from both. And I think you and I kind of do that because we try to pick what we like. I have no desire to 100% emulate manga, and on that same note, I'm also not beholden to Western storytelling at all. Even though I think both of us agree that right now I feel there's more to learn from manga than what I'm getting from American comics.
Well, part of that is also that American comics seems to be, I mean, the only new stuff that I see is in alternative and indie comics. And I don't mean indie comics like what in the network that we're aware of. I mean like web cartoons almost converted into print form. The kinds of things that you see somebody print on their home printer and then bring to a little convention hoping it'll sell like 2 copies or something like that. Guys and gals that don't follow the rules because they don't know the rules or care about it. They sort of autobiographical, that sort of thing.
Right.
What interests me the most about the disciplines is that I guess in American comics we're very much trying to still find how to make this market work again. And unfortunately that means like if artists can't make a living doing practicing the art, let's say, how can we get better at it? Whereas in Japan, they're able to make a living at it just enough. Most of them, they have assistants, they have an apprentice system going on where you can practice the craft, improve the craft, study the history of the craft. Um, and in America, it's just like let's say it's not enough. I walk into a publisher and say I want to make comics. Well, they say get in line. It's so hard. It's so hard to get in comics, and even if you're good enough, that's not enough to get. You know, publishers won't even contact you back unless they have something they want to assign to you or something like that. And there's only a few publishers, whereas I think in Japan there's so many publishers. I don't know,
Well,
but
and not just that, it's also cultural. Um, for example, you have that trope or you have that stereotype where it's like, oh, Asians know how to do math and they know how to draw and stuff like that. Which, by the way, Malcolm Gladwell has a really good explanation as to why Asians are so good at math, and it has nothing to do with genetics. It has to do with upbringing and the way they count numbers.
yeah.
But I actually have an explanation for why Asians uh, are so good at drawing, and it has nothing to do with genetics. It has to do with upbringing, because Asians focus so much culturally on academics. They see um, they see drawing as almost like a mental exercise. It's the idea that it's something that you do, something that you just grow up doing it when you're a kid. You're taught how to do it. There's not a lot of feeling put into it. So I remember like this would always annoy me. And I didn't go to art school. I took one semester of basic drawing in college as an elective, and I'm not going to say much about it, but basically there's this whole mentality where it's like art is a culture. Art is what you feel. Art is anything you make of it. Whereas, growing up, it's like you want to draw, you want people to recognize the pattern. That's the entire point.
Mm-hmm.
You want pareidolia. You want the magic trick where you draw something and you get someone to recognize what it is. There's none of this kind of Jackson Polakian idea of, oh, just make a pretty picture and people will like it. No, like I think culturally we kind of threw the idea out the window because ever since my brother and I were kids, my mom taught us how to draw. And even my cousins, I mean, this is not something where it's like, oh my gosh, they come from a rich family of artists. No, that's not what it was. It was just something you did. You just knew how, you just learned how to draw and you just built upon it. And that's why if you go to Instagram, like you have all these great artists from Korea and Japan and China, and they're all like 16 to 18, and they're drawing like better than anyone that we know who are in our 40s. And it's not because it's like, oh my gosh, the Asians, they're producing these genetic wonderkins. Like, no, we're taught how to do this from an early age. And even the culture of manga itself, we get this all the time, you and I, where it's like all we have to do is just follow what Japan is doing and do it in America. Well, good luck with that because it has nothing to do with just a simple business model. You're starting from birth. One, you raise your kids and your students on how to draw manga and the manga style. You learn how to do halftones. You learn how to use your X-Acto knife and to cut out patterns. You learn how which patterns correspond with what emotion. There is no emotional investment in it. It is a technical process that you can learn and you can teach classes on. After that, you have to have an environment that encourages the publication of fan material because in Japan they have the entire idea of dojin, which is like, hey, you want to create like a Street Fighter comic, get in line, make a Street Fighter fan comic, bring it to a convention, and we'll let you publish it. We might not put our seal of approval on it, but we're also going to turn a blind eye if you decide to publish it. So that is something that a lot of companies like Disney are not going to let you do because of their enforcement of copyright. So that's already setting you back. And then after that, you have to be willing to basically be like a technical assistant on a manga doing basically beta, which is just like filling in black spaces,
Mm-hmm.
and then being like a layout person, putting in backgrounds and emotional patterns. And then if you're lucky, you'll get credited, and then you'll get that position of being like the head artist where you're just spending time drawing like the primary figures. So it's not just a change of a business model, it's a change of the whole culture of the art. And I think we're a long ways off simply because of kind of our mentality towards art and comics in particular. And so I think that that's a rough road. And so I think the best thing that we can do is either try to foster an environment or try to ameliorate it by blending what we can.
One of the biggest challenges I always try to wrestle with when I talk to people in, let's say, those of us who do it part time or full time or are trying to break in, what are the obstacles, let's say, from reaching this promised land where comics in America explodes into maybe not where it was in the 90s exactly, but a place where any comic can exist as long as there's a market for it, as long as there's a creator that wants to work on it. It'll sell 1,000 copies and that artist can work on it as long as it's good. What's stopping us?
I have no idea. I mean, if I could answer that, we'd both be very rich. But I think part of it is the idea that we do tend to be limited in terms of our scope of what publishers are willing to put out there. One thing I've always liked that I've discovered recently about manga and anime is there is so many genres. In fact, my favorite genre of anime isn't even my favorite genre in Western comics. I mean, I like slice of life. And if you think about it on its surface, it's really boring. It's like, here's a manga about a guy trying to get into cooking school. And you're like, why am I going to buy this? Like, this is ridiculous. But it's so enthralling and so engaging.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why, I mean, in a way, it makes sense because you look at our other forms of American entertainment and you have this idea of reality television. I mean, reality television is essentially kind of slice of life. It's the idea that you have these people and they're doing kind of mundane tasks, but it's like, oh, we're going to follow them around with the camera and see what people do. Mark Pellegrini, my co-creator, he has this joke that I'm pretty sure he stole from someone else, which is his favorite anime is King of the Hill, and that just cracks me up because it's like, dude, that's completely true. I mean, I love King of the Hill, probably one of my favorite cartoons in the last decade that I completely got hooked on. But it's like, let's follow Peggy and Bobby as they go into the Megalo Mart and try to win this contest where they accurately guess how much their ice cream weighs so they can get their ice cream for free. And it's like, why am I watching this? Oh yeah, it's entertaining. And I think that there's almost like an in in the way comics are, at least in the modern era, there's almost like a rejection of that. Either that or there's a stigma associated with it where it's like, oh, in this independent comic, Susie and Jackie are friends in high school. Follow them on their adventures as they deal with trying to get into college and their boyfriends. And there's this kind of knee-jerk reaction where it's like, oh my gosh, it's more indie SJW stuff. Oh, pass. And I mean, the stigma is well warranted because a lot of times they are put out by publishers who maybe do have overt political leanings, and that's why I think there's that rejection to it by mainstream.
Mhm.
But I think also it's the idea that comics are so associated with superheroes that it's the concept that that's not what you do. Whereas in manga, it's just accepted that you can do it. And I think publishers, it's like superheroes are hot, baby. Like that's where you need to go if you want to break into it. It's like I don't want to tell a superhero story. In fact, like we have a superhero story, or on the surface it looks like a superhero story coming out next year, but trust me, it's not going to be one because we're trying to take it into a whole other direction in terms of storytelling.
Hmm. There's a million questions I want to ask about what you were saying. I do want to ask about your books, of course. Um, on the note that we were just talking about, I wanted to ask about the consumer experience, if you've heard anything about this, where let's say a lot of manga, the reason that it exploded in the early 2000s, back when I was really studying it, was because it was available in bookstores where you could get a coffee and read a
Yep.
stack of them for free. And because I was a late teen, early 20s, I didn't have a lot of money to spend, and that's all I could do. I had nothing but free time. I could just sit in a bookstore and read. And a lot of these books were multiple volumes long. It was hours and hours of reading pleasure. And as opposed to, let's say, a comics shop, which they're also struggling. And if I wanted to read a book there, I kind of only have time to leaf through something before the owner kind of gives me too many looks and I feel uncomfortable. I can't sit down. And then they say a lot of comics that are kind of exploding these days are available on the web, um, webtoon and that sort of thing, or web comics. Uh, is it? I don't know. I'm trying to formulate this into a question. I'm sorry.
No, you're
How
fine.
the reader experience? Maybe that's part of the problem is that I can't walk into. Let's say I want. It's a Saturday. I want to hang out. I want to go read a book. I go to the comic shop. Kind of leaf through whatever's on the shelf, superhero stuff, whatever. Oh, this cover looks kind of cool. I pick it up. I leaf through it. Yeah, maybe I'll read it. Maybe I won't. I don't think that lends itself to a lot of browsing. And I've heard that most people who walk into comic shops these days only buy books or look at books that they've heard have good reviews or if their friend recommended it. Whereas I guess in a bookstore, it's more browsy. How can creators like us create things that will, I don't know. I don't. I guess I should interview like a a college student to figure out like how do you browse. But what do you think is the best way to get people to browse our work and sample it? And
It's tough. It's so hard. And again, in my opinion, it boils down to two things: culture and the psychology of consumption. For example, I think the reason why we get those dirty looks in comic book shops is because it is much easier to freely digest a 24-page book, right?
true, true.
And so the reason you get those dirty looks is because you can theoretically consume that book in about 5 minutes, just sitting there and paging through it and being like, pass. And the person at the counter is like, what the heck? Like you just read that book for free when I expect you to buy it first and then enjoy it or not enjoy it. And so you have that there's a kind of stigma to associated with it because of the consumer and the retailer, the interaction and the agreement, the unspoken contract is broken. Whereas in a bookstore, if you're going to try and, I mean, you could take the Bible out and read it, but that is actually, they say time is money. That's an investment of your time being able to sit there and consume it. So you're more likely to go to a bookstore, not buy a book, but leaf through it, preview it, and be like, okay, I have seen enough. I'm going to commit to this by giving my money and therefore giving my time, but time on my own by my own standard and my own schedule, and then so you take it home. I think that this is the part where it's going to be really, really tough. So somewhere in the middle, one reason why manga, I think, it does so well is one, it looks like it was meant to be read. So psychologically, it's basically begging for you to pick it up, read it, put it in your back pocket, put it in your backpack. You're not really worried about destroying it. It's like, no, I am meant to be read. I am meant to be taken apart. I am meant to be enjoyed. Don't worry about the collector's value. Read me, please. Like, there's just something about it that says that. And now we're guilty of this just from the medium that we're working in, but comics, because it has a collector's value attached to it, we're aiming for kind of like, oh, no, 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 no. You have like this, you want to keep it pristine. You want to keep it protected. You want it to look as nice as possible. And I feel so guilty about that because honestly, like, I'm part of it. I do like comics that look nice. I like having them on my shelf and I like having them presentable. And they exist with the manga that I have right next to it. Where there's kind of a compromise in between is like the European market, primarily in France. France is a huge consumer of manga, but they're also producers of bande dessinée, which is like basically album sized comics that they put out. I think that a good model, and this is something, and this is where bridging this gap is the part where I have no answer to. Bridging that gap is someone like a Doug TenNapel, right? Like a Doug TenNapel, he puts out like 100-page volumes, and they are meant to be read, meant to be consumed, but they're also presented in that kind of album-sized format where you definitely get what you pay for. It is meant to be digested, but it's also meant to be preserved. So he is onto something. The only problem is you have to be a Doug TenNapel to do that because I know guys like you and me, I would love to just spend 6 months working on 100-page magnum opus, but I can't. I don't. I mean, maybe 2 or 3 years from now, when I don't have so many IPs going on, I probably can commit to one. But just in terms of the backing that he has on his projects and the overall quality of it, like we're just not there yet. There has to be a culture that's willing to foster that before we can get to that point. And in France, you have kind of you have your bookstores, you have your cafes, but you also have your tabacs, and that's basically your newsstand. That's where you go to get your tobacco, your convenience goods, but it's also where you go to get your newspapers, your periodicals, your manga, your magazines, kind of everything. And right now, we don't. You basically have your comic book stores and you have your Barnes and Nobles. It's pretty much it. So there's not really a culture that's fostering that.
So, a lot of us have been creating these microcultures online
Right.
through Twitter and that sort of thing. But I don't think it's in the healthiest state. But it's sort of like a marketplace, you could say. We have to, as creators, you and I, guys like ourselves, we have to keep reminding people that we exist, or unfortunately other creators are going to come in and sort of take that mind space. So we're all kind of, it's kind of a sad competitive but also cooperative experience. We're keeping each other, how do I put this, us creators are keeping each other in the, I'm thinking in computer terms, in the RAM of the marketplace. Remember that we exist, please. But also, we have to be creating books at a fast enough rate that people can be buying them and then want to buy the next one. It's an unfortunate emulation of what you could consider to be tabak, you said? The
Yeah.
newsstand. Back in the early days of comics, of course, they used to sell comics in dollar stores, newsstands, convenience stores, that sort of thing, and then they got pulled for whatever reason, for multiple reasons, I should say. But nowadays, you can't, for instance, buy a copy of Wall Might at a 7-Eleven, you know.
Right.
But I don't know. I guess it's an open question. That's just something I always am thinking about: is what can we do to create a more prosperous situation for ourselves, for the audience, and for our peers, the creators, who are trying to make a living at this. Some of us are able to do it. Some of us are struggling, have to do stuff on the side, and so we don't create as much work, which unfortunately spirals us back out of the marketplace, I suppose.
Yeah, it's that whole idea of publish or perish. It exists in academia too, where it's like, look, you got to produce papers, you got to have research.
Yeah.
If you don't, you're going to lose your tenure. You might lose your job, and you're definitely going to be forgotten about by your peers. And the part that that's so disheartening to me is that I know so many good artists, and the entire reason that they don't have exposure is because either they're non-social media or they're not social. And it's this idea that do you have to be showman and creator? Because a lot of us would just rather just be creators. We just want to focus all of our efforts in just making stuff, and then hopefully that generates the attention that we need to funnel that into sales and making sure that we can have a steady number of product coming out. And
Mhm.
juggling that is tough. I mean, for example, like I know a lot of people hate Twitter. I actually like it. I like it because it's like a mental exercise where you have to basically formulate pretty clever thoughts in like 150 characters or less. So I think I consider it almost like a puzzle. Like, oh my gosh, like I want to say all of this stuff, but how do I do it in as little characters as possible
Mhm.
to make sure that that point can get across? So I don't mind it as a social media space, but it's more like juggling all of this stuff. Like, oh my gosh, I'm not even on Snapchat. I don't have a Twitch stream. I don't even know how to use any of this stuff. I am basically on the basic platforms of Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. That is it. And trying to learn and trying to juggle a bunch of social media spheres for me personally is difficult, and I don't have the time to keep up with it and do all of this other stuff on the side. But I think the best thing that we can do is, in a way, it's good that people like you and I and other freelancers exist, because I think that just like anything that's happening in the gig economy, the best answers are actually going to be coming out from outside the industry, not inside. Because one thing I can tell for sure is I don't know about you, but I'm like not a competitive person by nature.
Mhm.
I've never been competitive. I've actually never won trophies or medals or anything because I just don't care. I would rather just get along with people and bolster people. Like, like Matt Weldon, he's a really good friend of mine. He's a superior artist to me, but there's no like animosity. I'm just like, holy cow, I want to learn from you. Like, I want to get as good as you can get. And I like it because he's the same way. There's just no competition. We don't see each other as competitors. We feel like it's the win-win situation.
Mhm.
And ironically, um, even though Asians are notoriously competitive, I think in the manga and publishing world, they just don't have that. They're all very friendly to each other. They help each other. They're promoting each other. They see that it's a big blue ocean that everyone can take a dip into. And I know that in American comics, it is not like that at all. And that's probably one reason why I don't have that many friends who are professionals, because a lot of it's very cutthroat. A lot of it is definitely this idea of there's a finite pie and we can't all eat at that pie, so we got to take these people out. It's like I don't see it that way
Mhm.
at all. And maybe I'm wrong because I'm looking at it from the outside, but that's just not the culture that we grew up in.
No, I agree with you completely. There's a certain when there's only so many resources to float around. Uh, it's like a game of Pac-Man. There's only so many pellets on the ground, and we are all trying to get those pellets. But that's not really a big picture kind of perspective. It just so happens that some people are talented, and maybe they want to grab all the market share for themselves. But I agree with your perspective that, for instance, I've been watching a show called Mon Ben, if you've ever heard of it. I have been posting about it every morning, and yeah, every morning this week. But I've been watching it for a long time, where it's manga artists basically interviewing each other, and it's this wonderful, you just kind of have a camera over their shoulder and they're talking about process and what are you thinking about as you're making those strokes and what kind of tools do you use, and there's just a very obvious pleasure in the craft that I think is absent in the kind of interactions that I see on Twitter, for example. That I don't want to get too into toxicity. I know we've been talking for too long, but I really am disgusted by the kinds of interactions I've been seeing, especially on Twitter, where it's like there is no love for the craft. It's just a bunch of people trying to climb on top of each other, and I'm guilty of this too. But I really can't. I don't want to, for instance, if we all lived in the same city magically and we weren't spread across a giant country, I wouldn't want to have dinner with these people. They sound like
Right.
jerks. But like, say for people like yourself and other people I've interviewed on this channel, I bet we could talk for hours and hours. And like, I want to go through your sketchbook. I want to talk about tools. Because I can tell you love the craft.
Right.
There seems to be a sort of absence in it. Is it American comics? I've never followed American comics so much, but I don't. It's like I don't want to get to know these people as people, as professionals. Okay, your work is good, but I don't see. There's something missing.
Yes, and let me piggyback off that real quick because this is like the black pill of this episode. They always say never meet your heroes, and there is a lot of truth to that, especially when looking at the pros. And I'm just going to be very candid here. We do a lot of conventions, and I have met a lot of people who are famous in comics, and it's disappointing because when you meet them, they're jerks. And suddenly, like the starry-eyed, like, oh my gosh, like that person's a legend. They worked on this book. You just don't care anymore because a part of you likes these people because they either wrote something and created something that you have enjoyed in storytelling, or as an artist, they are able to manifest something that you appreciate on a technical level. And a part of you just wants to know more about that because we cannot help but think that the mind that created such good things is good in of themselves. It's the logical fallacy of association. Um, Sadly, they're few and far in between. Luckily, I've made a lot of friends. Obviously, both of us have over a short period of time. But the people whose company I enjoy are the people who we see very much eye to eye in terms of craftsmanship. The writers I enjoy talking with, I like them because I know that they love writing and they want to tell a good story, and that's what they're invested in. And then the artists that I really like, there is a joy and a sublimity in knowing that they love what they do. I mentioned Matt Weldon a lot, and it's just because I hang out with him all the time. But I gotta tell you this funny story. It was the first time that the agency that I'm affiliated with, it's like an artist collective, the main artists who do a lot of shows, we finally did a show all together. So we were able to break bread on like in my hometown or my home state in Arkansas. So we were sitting around this table and there's like 8 of us and we all can draw in some way, shape, or form. But the funniest thing was we realized at the end of dinner that we were in this fancy German restaurant and we noticed that our tablecloth was the type that you could actually draw on if you had a crayon. So we just pulled this pen out and we just started sharing it around and we were just doodling like little kids on this table and we were just cracking up because we got to the point where we were like it was like when you were a kid and you didn't really care how well the guy next to you could draw. It was just you just wanted to do it. You wanted to show what you could do. Sometimes it was silly, sometimes it was really technical, but we were just kind of drawing and yucking it up and being kind of immature about it. But there was just a joy in doing that because we all approached it in our own unique ways. And that's something you can't do with a lot of these people. And this is the accusation that gets leveled at us all the time. It's like, well, if you're not make like it's like, so why are you doing this? Well, I do it because I want to entertain people. I've I I'm a religious man, and I don't mean that in a holier than thou way. I mean I'm a practicing Catholic, and I do believe that I was given a talent, and it was meant to be used on this earth for a purpose, and I have to do that. Like I feel like that's an earthly thing I have to do. So when people ask me, well, why do you make these books? Well, I feel like there's an obligation. I feel like it's in my bones. Like that's what I need to do, and money's not important as long as I'm getting compensated fairly so that I can do this and get compensated for it. That's fine. And I can't begin to tell you how many people in private tell me, "Ugh, that's such an SJW thing. Like money is everything. Like if you're not making 6 figures, you're failing at it." And I am so furious at those people. Like, I am immensely disgusted.
I'm
And I
triggered.
can mention 3 people, and yeah, I think some people wouldn't be surprised as to who I'm mentioning. I don't even care if this is put live, but I just flat out tell them, I'm like, look, I that's disgusting. And to call me that, someone who has championed free speech in all its forms. I mean, I don't even care if you make a political book about a rival political opponent that I don't like. That's your prerogative. You do it. You do you. That's a free market. to call me an SJW just for not embracing greed, but by embracing kind of like capitalism to the point where I am free to do what I want, even if I don't want to make that much money off of it or don't have that as a prerogative. That's gross. Like that's part of a culture that I think creates the toxicity that you see in a lot of in Western storytelling and in the Western comics culture and industry.
Mm-hmm. I have a suspicion then that the more we interact with people, maybe they don't ever articulate what we're talking about, but there's something in their demeanor, things that they write about that you can just sort of tell. Maybe subconsciously, I can sort of feel that I'm not going to get along with this person. I can feel it. And maybe they never say the words that you were saying. But, like, for instance, if they're trying to create a book just for the sake of making it into a product that they could convert into money, like, it's not like I'm not making this book because I need to. Like, I wake up in the morning and I have to tell this story because it's like a shared dream that I need to tell you about. Like, dude, I had this craziest dream, and the only way I could tell you about it is if I write 30 volumes of this book for you, and I'm going to illustrate it for you, and it's just this craziest story in the world. I'm going to tell you about it because there's I'm sorry, I'm stumbling over myself because I'm so crazy about this. There's a passion, there's a sort of love where it's when I was young, I would read stacks of books, and there was this. I would light up with inspiration, and I loved it. I was filled with great characters and great art and stories, and these books were so generous. And then, for instance, somebody wrote me a quick little thing once on Twitter or something, and I never thought this would actually happen to me. But someone was like saying, "Hey man, I'm in the hospital and I read one of your books and it helped me feel better." And not like obviously it didn't make them better, but it cheered them up. And I was like,
Ah,
holy, I don't want to curse, but I was like, oh my God, it actually happened. I was so moved that like it made my day. Like I couldn't think about anything else. Like that's happened to me so many times when I was a kid. I would read Charlie Brown comic or something or a manga that, and I'm like, wow, that's it. That's what I want to do. I want to earn a living, obviously. It's nice to earn a living, but I'm in this to make people's lives better. And not in the cheesy way, like healing their souls or anything. But I think comics,
right.
a good story, it does something to what I could say is the soul or the spirit of a person, but like the psyche. Good stories, good art. It has this value that I can't put a number on, but it touches the very bottom of a person's heart, a good comic. That I don't think these jerks who just want to make a buck, they don't get it. And I think I just naturally can't stand them. Something in my heart's like, no, don't talk to these people anymore. They're not in it for the same reasons I am.
I can't I can't stand it because I can't stand people who don't have principle. Like that's really what it boils down to.
Mm.
And by principle, I don't mean my principles. I mean that you have an internal system of logic that you are in accordance with 100% of the time, or you strive for. There is no hypocrisy in and of yourself and in your behavior. But you're talking about the things that we do because um, there is that very enriching component to it, and this is like in our bones. So I'll give you like a prime example. Oh my gosh, I just made a pun that you didn't even realize I was gonna make. So the one major celebrity that I've met that was an absolute joy was Peter Cullen. So Peter Cullen is the voice of many people, voice of Eeyore, voice of Optimus Prime, primarily. And we did this charity thing. I partnered up with a company in Chicago, and we did these charity T-shirts. And Peter Cullen he agreed to lend his likeness for it, and so we were doing these. We did this sale. It was really successful, and it was actually the first major convention I got invited to, which was BotCon. And so I got there, and someone had told Peter they're like this guy who did your charity T-shirt. He's actually gonna be at the convention, and he told the handler, it's like I want to meet this guy. Like make sure that he can stop by. And so I stopped by, and it was like in his private room, and I go in there, and he's like crying, and he's crying because he met like these other throngs of fans before, and I'm kind of shocked because this is a guy who's been Optimus Prime for years And I was like, I told his manager, I was like, is he always like this? And he's like, yes, he's like this all the time. And if you look at interviews with him, he tells this very good story. He was like, I was a voice actor to make a buck, right? Like, someone told me, like, hey, there's this casting call. It's for a cartoon involving giant robots, and they fight each other. And he was like, okay, I can do that. And he said, the voice of Optimus Prime. He channeled his brother, who was a Marine, and he channeled some John Wayne into it. And that was kind of his job. But he said it wasn't until Optimus Prime got killed and he didn't even think about it because he was like, yeah, characters gonna die, they gotta sell toys, and that was the end of it before the internet. And he got all this fan mail when he went in one day. He's like, what the heck is this? And it's like, it's all the fan mail from all the people that like either were sad that you got killed or have loved your character. And he said it was then that he realized like this goes beyond just a buck. This is like I've touched someone
Mhm.
and multiple people are being impacted by what I do. And so getting to meet him was very important to me because it teaches you something about humility. You have this 70-year-old man who's been doing this forever, and he never forgot that. Like he never lost that initial shock of realizing how much of an impact you can have. And I told this to Doug Ernst. I was like, "There's a couple things that are going to shock you, and you're never going to forget it." It's like the first time you see your comic kind of take form, when you see the line art for the first time or that first cover you do, and you're like, holy cow, like this exists. It manifested. It existed in my mind, and now it's made incarnate. Like this is crazy. And then I said, the next thing that's going to shock you is when you start seeing like it being polished and then finished and then refined. And then when you get that physical book in, like you can't believe it, like you made it. And then I said the step after that is when someone who's bought your book meets you in person and they might have traveled a distance to see you
Mm.
and they want it signed because it means that you made a difference. Like you made a difference in someone's life. And I tell this to people all the time. I was like, I appreciate fan art. And the reason I appreciate fan art is because I don't care how long you took to draw it. It means that my character existed in your head for that period of time that you were doing that.
Mm.
Like that concept, if you understand it and you appreciate it, there is no way you can walk away from the craft thinking that it's just something to make a buck. Like I think you're selling yourself short. Like I believe that almost warrants like a slap in the face because it means that you're taking something that not many people have, whether that be a storytelling talent or a motor talent like drawing. You're taking that and you're basically just saying that you're doing this because it generates something for you. And I don't understand that. And Mark and I have always been very grateful for people who we meet at conventions. Like, I try not to get emotional about it, but there was like, we did this recent one, and this guy came up to us and he was like, I literally own every single thing that you've ever done. I own every cover you've done. I own every book you've made. And he proved it. He showed it to me. And I'm not a great artist. Like I'm like, on the totem pole, I'm maybe like a D-lister at the most. But I made a difference in someone's life. I'm not gonna throw that away. And that's why I am so strict when it comes to my views on customer service satisfaction and principle. I have never strayed away from. I have never talked disparagingly to a customer because I cherish the idea that they're a person that I hope to touch one day. They might not like me as a person, but I hope that they like what I do and that they know that I put 100% into it. We don't do anything that we just phone in.
I always thought of it as a sort of like a game of ping pong. If the ball is the book, I'm going to serve you the ball, and then you serve it back or you hit it back to me, and we'll have this back and forth. But then you have, I always talk about this on the show, we have this word medium.
Mhm.
Comics is a medium, which means it's a sort of bridge. My brain is going to be bridged into your brain, and we're going to have an interaction that goes back and forth, hopefully. The comic is a sort of thing that extends between the two of us. And the more times we go back and forth, it's like a kind of relationship is forming, or the bridge itself is maybe the thing that we can both cooperate on. But I love the idea of this generosity, this back and forth. I hate I guess I'm just repeating what you said, and I'm sorry, but I can't stand the idea of I'm going to build a bridge, and you're going to keep sending things my way, and then I'll build another bridge, and you keep sending things my way. There's no back and forth. There's no relationship. But I think the best
Uh-huh.
books are the ones that speak to us.
Right.
It,
No, I completely agree because you do have your disposable entertainment, which is fun. You can definitely generate a lot of happiness that way. And if that's your ultimate goal, that's fine. But I think ultimately everyone kind of has that magnum opus that's residing, especially creators. You have a magnum opus residing in your soul that you want to outlive you, right? Like that's the thing that you want to show people because that's the thing that matters. And I mean, we kind of do that because our like Mark and I have political satire, and that's definitely to not only comment on something that's happening historically, but it's also to entertain. Now, its disposability is anyone's guess in terms of how much they cherish it. But for example, especially with like with the current president, President Trump, we have we're friends with the Angel Moms. So there's one in particular, and we dedicated two of our books to her, and that made the world to her. You're looking at someone who lost their son, right? And so the topic of like illegal immigration is like a really big deal to her, and that to have those books exist and have them dedicated to someone and have it mean something, even we came to the realization that this is not disposable entertainment for us, because the reality is that if it made a difference in someone's life, it exceeds beyond that, and it's something that I want to be proud of. So we don't phone anything in. Black Ops is probably our franchise that we want to outlive us. It's something that hopefully I can pass down to my kids if they want to be creators someday. um, just because it has a lot of craftsmanship and a lot of very subtle, maybe moral tellings on patriotism and loving your country, and the underdog kind of doing what they can to do their best. But we all want to kind of leave this behind as our legacy for as long as it lasts. You have that poem Ozymandias. The basic general's motive of that story is that nothing lasts forever. Everything that we create that's physical has a shelf life, metaphorically speaking, and it can go away at any time, even long after we're gone. And so, I I don't have time to waste on people who look at it as only like um, a venture to make money. I think you're selling yourself short as a creator and as a service to your fans.
the medium can be so much more than just a cash grab. And it breaks my heart to see something that I've studied for my, I would say, as geez, I used to read the Sunday Funnies since I was, 3, 4 years old. I've been studying it my whole life. I hate to see it reduced to just another piece of merch. But
Uh-huh.
I mean, the best comics can even speak across countries, languages, and even time. It's interesting to me to think that like cave paintings are comics. If you go back to the Scott McCloud analysis of,
Yes,
you know,
yes.
hieroglyphics can be comics, but I would like to think that the best comics from our generation, if it exists 1,000 years from now, can still be read and enjoyed by people, even if maybe they don't speak the same language. I like the idea of being able to create this beautiful, sacred thing, even if it's just entertainment, that can
Mhm.
still speak to humans across the world, across time and space. I think we have to ask more out of this medium than just a couple bucks now. But that's why I would say, gosh, it's been an hour and a half. I'm so sorry it's taken so long. I try to do an
No,
hour of these.
no, I'm fine.
I
This
I
is
would
great.
say, but that's why I think I don't know if anyone's listening that can like feel this, like you're a real creator, and it's such a joy to talk to a real creator who gets it, who loves it, who will be doing this until their hand doesn't work anymore, and even then you might still find a way.
Literally, because oh my gosh, I was having some pain
Oh geez.
between my chest and my shoulder because of the way I sit when I draw.
Oh.
But I'm just like, all I ask for is just one more day to keep on doing this. And every time we get a book out, I'm just like, thank you. I gotta move on to the next one. But I was able to make it this far. But on the other hand, Mark and I, Mark is not a religious person at all, but I think he's also not an a-religious person. He's not an atheist, but he doesn't mind me saying this, but in terms of blessings, we made it to a point where we can do this as a hobby, and we are impervious to a lot of the slings and arrows thrown at us. They can talk about us all that they want, but the reality is, I think that there's a frustration because they know they can't control us. They know that as long as we make our goals, and even for our most recent books, it's flexible funding where it's kind of like we will make your book better, but if need be, you're helping us kind of achieve this goal, but we have the luxury of being able to kind of do this on our own. And so we are able to treat it as a hobby. And I think to a lot of the people who just see this as a money enterprise, it's disgusting because it's the idea that, oh my gosh, like these idealists, like how dare you do that? Like that's crazy.
Mhm.
You go back to Calvin and Hobbes. I've been sharing this strip with a few friends of mine, but it's the strip where Calvin is doing his list for Santa Claus, and he says, "Hey Hobbes, like I'm making my list for Santa. What do you want?" And Hobbes says, "What do I want? I have everything I want. I have a happy house, and I have a best friend, and I get fed every day. There's nothing more a tiger could want." And he walks away. And Calvin, he looks despondently at his list, and he's like, "It is such a shame to be a tiger of so little imagination." And so, like, that kind of encapsulates it because I feel like there's those of us who are like Hobbes, where it's like we're doing this, like, oh my gosh, like it's been 2 years and we're doing it. We're making these books. Like, holy cow, I never thought we'd be doing this, but here we are.
Mhm.
And then these other naysayers who are like, it must be terrible to be such a moron to just do this and not want to be making like a ton of money on it. But c'est la vie, right? Like that's
Yeah.
fine if you want to think that way, but it's not stopping us.
No. And part of that also, I'll let you go, but just to close the thought, I think what we have in mind is the long game. We've been doing this and nurturing a love for this for our whole lives, I think. And some of these projects might be flashes in the pan. I'm not going to say what I'm talking about exactly, but I get the feeling that, I mean, how many books have you put out in the past few years? It's been a lot, right?
Counting everything that's been published and even in production right now, 8.
Jeez.
And that's nonstop. I draw every day except Sundays, typically. I'm not drawing, I'm coloring or lettering.
Yeah.
I can't help it. Like there's not a part of me that can sit still. I think we typically will take 2 weeks off in the year. So I typically will take a vacation in the spring and a vacation in the fall.
Mhm.
And even on those days, I'll sketch something in the morning just to make sure that I keep in practice. But it's like you gotta keep going. Like you make it work somehow. But yeah, my productivity, my art is not that great, but my productivity I can be proud of because I don't stop. Like that's the thing.
Have you heard of the flow state?
I have not heard of the flow state.
Oh man, I have this written down as an old. We talked about Malcolm Gladwell. He talks about this.
Okay.
I swear I have to let you go after this. I'm so sorry for going so long.
No, you're
Okay.
fine. You're fine.
The flow state is. You got to look it up on YouTube. I can't explain it as well as these other guys, but basically it means it's this. If I say I get in the flow, do you know what I mean? Like there's just something happens to me where I kind of lose my sense of space and time, and I'm in my body, but I'm not thinking about my body. I lose a sense of hunger. I lose a sense of time, and I'm just drawing. And it's this weird meditative enlightenment state where I am the piece of art. It's almost an out of body experience, something like that.
No, I completely can empathize with that. That's actually why. I mean, we talk about speed, but part of it is also a personal inclination. You could call it maybe the flow state. When I'm working on a page, I get so engrossed in it that if I don't finish it that day, it's just not the same. I come back to it tomorrow, the next day, and it's like I kind of lost my mojo. Like I don't even know, like I was in the groove, and then
Yes.
now I don't even know where I'm going with this. It actually happened to me recently. I was lettering these pages, and then I got sick. So last week I was sick from Saturday till Wednesday, and then I've been in recovery. But I was in bed basically for 2 days, and I couldn't do anything. And I was like, all right, time to get back to lettering. It just wasn't the same. I mean, I sat down and I was like, oh, like it's like I have to start from scratch again in terms of trying to get myself pumped up to do this. So yeah, I mean, I try to keep that state going, but even when, even when I'm ill, I do my darndest to just keep on going.
If I remember, there's a chart, and anyone who's listening, I actually insist that you look up the flow state. There's a chart where the higher your skill level at something and the higher the challenge, if it's like a 50-50 ratio of challenge and skill, you'll hit the flow state every time. And that's how you can tell as a professional that this is your vocation. You're meant to do this. If you keep hitting, like if you're an athlete, let's say, but
Hmm.
if the ratio is off, if the challenge is too high and your skill level is not high enough, you'll be frustrated. But if your
Right.
skill level is too high and the challenge is too low, then you'll get bored. So the challenge level and your skill has to be at a 50-50 ratio in order to hit this state. But I find that even late nights, like let's say tonight, for me it's really late, it's 10 o'clock, right? But if I'm painting and I'm really like on fire, I hate to also step away from my desk.
Yeah, to
But
use the bathroom or to eat or
right,
whatever. That's the worst, is
yeah,
using the bathroom. Oh my gosh, this might be too much information. I don't care. This has been
no.
a good conversation. You can go ahead and publish this whole thing. I I drink typically I had to cut down on 1 cup, so I drink 2 cups of coffee a day. There's nothing that makes me more mad when I'm just sitting there and I'm like, just gonna wait, like I gotta finish this panel. I I I don't care if I wet myself. Like I really need to get this done because if not, I'm definitely gonna lose the groove. That's the worst. But you were talking about this idea of the flow state, and so what it reminds me of is when I was in graduate school, I took ballroom dancing classes, and this is like something that not a lot of people know about, but I loved ballroom dancing, and I was not good at it at all. But there was just something about it where I liked doing it. I could see why. I didn't have an appreciation of ballet or anything like that, but I was like, I see why people can like this because there's something about the free flow of physical expression set to tempo. There's like a beautiful harmony in synchronizing motor movement with music, where it's kind of like you take the medium of music, which was made by intelligence, combined with intelligent choreography, and there's just something very appealing about it. And doing that, I think I equate it. Let's end talking about Matt Weldon. I love watching Matt Weldon draw because, like I said, he's like a human printer. He can take a pencil and he doesn't have to look at layout or composition or anything. He sees it, his mind sees it, and he can put it on paper and he can print it. And every time I see him draw, there is no struggle, there is no second guessing himself, there's no calculus. There's a smile on his face, and poof, there it is. And going back to a religious expression, it's like Genesis. He spoke, and there it was. It
Mhm.
manifested, and it's beautiful. Like I see that, and I'm like, if I only had that talent, I would I would basically be in like euphoria all the time because you are able to create something without even thought. It is there. You are given the medium, and it appears, and you just keep on going. And it's no wonder that he can do 2 pages a day, like the machine that he is. Um, so I think that we're all kind of united together in terms of our goals, which is good. And there's a lot of good people out there, for sure.
Well, I think the people who are the most passionate about the craft are going to last the longest. Whatever we're seeing over the past couple of years and whatever's going to happen over the next few years, I think we're going to use biblical language. We're going to separate the wheat from the chaff eventually.
Well, it's like what you have told me before. It's like us, there's a lot of us who we know personally, and we're thirsty for it.
Yeah.
We want it. It is in our bones. We can feel it. And there's no amount of cash that you can drop on us that alters the trajectory that we're willing to go with it. Even if we have to pull ourselves up from our bootstraps, there's a way to make it happen. And as we say with our like Black Ops tagline, we have the means, we have the men, and we have the mission. That's it. You'll notice that we don't say we have the money because that even though that is relatively important, it is not a prerogative for us.
Well, I think that's how anyone listening, you can tell what's going to sound like it sounds like a great book. You guys have to look these up. List them for us real quick. How can we find your stuff? How can we support you?
Amazon, you can find Thump the First 100 Days. You can also find typically on eBay, you can find prior printings of our books like My Hero Magademia, Black Ops 1 and 2, which was a two-issue series. You can find those on eBay. They're actually pretty difficult to find. Antarctic Press, they sold out and they never reprinted them because at some point they wanted to make a trade. We didn't want to wait that long. We went ahead and just printed it ourselves. My friend has an imprint in Texas called Iconic Comics. They just opened up recently. And so the trade paperback they can actually find with our campaign. So if you back Black Ops at any tier level, at checkout, you can actually add it as an add-on item in case you want to get a copy of that. But yeah, I mean, you just Google our name into any shopping engine and you should be able to find copies of our works. Like we said before, we've only made 8 books, so it's not like a huge plethora of offerings, but we're out there, that's for sure.
Well, I don't think you could say we've only made 8 books, but I understand. It's going to be a
You were
very
in the rise. You were in the rising stars of manga, Mister. So that is an accomplishment that I wish I could put on my resume. You'll be happy to know that I actually looked for it because we were at this convention last weekend, and there's this dealer who always brings like bargain manga. He had every single copy of the Rising Stars of Manga, but here is the catch: they were all shrink wrapped, which means I could not look through and find which one you were
Oh,
in.
that sucks. Oh, too bad. I'll give
Because
you mine.
I was gonna buy it. I was gonna buy it and show it to you as a surprise. But if you just tell me which volume you're in, I promise you, I will buy it and show it to you because I want to brag about it on Twitter.
I think it's volume 5. I'm not sure, but yeah, if anyone's listening, if you ever want to make me like turn beet red and pass out, that it's the art is so bad. But
You
oh my,
say that, you say that. I own 2 of those volumes, and there's a reason why I own 2 of them because I was like, holy cow, this art's so good.
it was such a fun idea. I wish things didn't go the way they did with Borders and Tokyo Pop and everything. They had something. It was so close. But that's another topic for another. Look, I mean, we're still carrying the torch. That was, I think, 2004, 2005.
Uh-huh.
So 15 years later, I'm still trying to break into comics. But you know what? This crowdfunding miracle has happened, and we don't know where it's going to go the next year and a half, 2 years, whatever. I know that guys like yourself and me, whoever's listening, we're struggling so hard to make this happen. Just let's.
Yeah, and it's a temporary thing. I mean, you always hear that criticism where it's like this is not a solution to the problems in the industry, and I agree 100%. But I think we're trying to find an alternative. But in the meantime, this is a pretty good option. But we're always open for those ideas. Thinking outside of the box mentality is what we crave and what we're looking for.
Yep. Well, man, I could talk to you for another few hours, but I know you got a thing. You got another show almost after this recording, right?
Yeah, we have a Bunderdome, which is just going to be general talk.
Okay.
So that's just we would call it the Briar Patch. Is basically where we just talk nonsense because I'm a chatty catty, so I can't help it.
And for anyone listening, your channel is the Bunderdome, or it's the show
It's
name?
called the Bunder.
Okay.
It's both. I think it's both the show name and the Bunder and the channel title.
Very good. So anyone listening, as soon as this episode's finished, head over to the Bunderdome, and you can listen to more of Tim and Friends. And
Absolutely.
man, what better way
Well,
to?
we'll have to do this again sometime.
For sure, man. Of course. And if you guys are ever at a convention in the New York area, please let me know, and I'll come visit.
Absolutely. That is a guarantee for sure.
All right, you
I
got
need
it.
more friends up there. I need more friends up in that northeast portion of the country.
You got it. 100%. There's a stink coming from somewhere. I can't tell where. Somewhere in New Jersey.
Yeah, and the pleasant aromas in the New York area, but I haven't spent enough time up there to make friends. So I'm looking forward to it.
Oh, forget it.
Something to get me.
Yeah, man. If you're in New York, no, I got to take you all over the place. There's a million great places I can show you. But yeah,
Cool.
we'll definitely make it happen. So again,
Okay.
Tim Lim, you guys, what's your Twitter handle?
It's at POTUS Thump. That is if you want the full spread of everything I talk about. If you just want the art, it's at Ninja Ink Art. That is NinjaInkArt.
All right, very good. And I'll put the links to both of those in the description for anyone listening.
Cool.
Okay, I will say goodnight to you. Thanks again for everyone for listening. Share this around if you liked it, and I hope to talk to Tim again very soon. Thanks for coming, man.
Absolutely. Anytime, George. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, my
Have a good one.
pleasure. Yeah, you too.
Bye bye.